Okie dokie, a podcast for those addicted to the study of Scripture. Welcome, fellow addicts. This is your safe place to OD. Samuel!
Here I am.
What are we going to talk about today?
Today we are talking about the Gospels. This is Gospels part 107. Last week we continued this back and forth between the scribes, the bad Pharisees, the Sadducees, the elders who are trying to plot against Jesus and entangle him with his words. We had a couple different stories. The first was them asking about money that has the image of Caesar on it, and asking him, like, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or what? And we actually, I learned something new, because I've always just heard it's like, just give your tithe to, what belongs to the church, and give your taxes to what belongs to the government. But Paul pointed out last week that it's much more tap it into that image-bearing thing, that since Caesar's image is on the coin, you give whatever portion he's asking for back to him, but then whatever Jesus said, give to God what is God's. Like, what has God's image? It's humanity, and it's this sense of giving up your entire life, like offering up your life as a sacrifice and as an offering to God, which I thought was a really, really cool image and lesson for us. And then we spent the rest of the episode having an in-depth conversation about why the Sadducees were asking about marriage, and had the story of this man and wife, and the man died, and then the deceased man had several brothers, 7 of them in total, and each brother took this woman as his wife, and then they died, and so on and so forth. And they asked them, like, who's going to be married in heaven? And Jesus, like, there's not going to be any marriage in heaven. And we talked about the role that marriage plays here in this age, and why that role, that covenant, is no longer applicable in the kingdom and the world to come, because of what God and what Messiah are doing to the restored earth, the restored Jerusalem, etc.
Yeah, that was a good conversation. A lot of, it related to just marriage generally, but its purpose, all that. That was good. And, I don't think we said it last week, but I think some people might look back at this and go, hey, this woman, I mean, we don't know her. No reason to think she was a bad person, but, she could have been like the original Black Widow. But we're going to go on, because remember, we talked about this was at least some in the, the academic realm or whatever, they refer to this as the 4 questions. And we said that there were 3 that were asked of Jesus, 1 asked by Jesus. So we're on to number 3. This, again, is asked of Jesus. And it says, let's see, we're actually, let's get our bearings here. We're in Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 to 40. And we're also looking at Mark chapter 12, verses 28 through 34. And since Mark gives us a little more detail, I'm going to read from that one, and I just want to catch one little thing on the end of Matthew. But anyway, let me start with Mark 12:28. And one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another. And seeing that he answered them well, asked him, which commandment is the most important of all? And Jesus answered, the most important is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. And the scribe said to him, you are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one, and there is no other besides him. and to love him with all the heart and with all the understanding and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself is much more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. And when Jesus saw that he answered wisely, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." And after that, no one dared to ask him any more questions. I just want to go back the very end of the Matthew reading. So this is going to be Matthew chapter 22, verse 40. He slips in one little piece of information that I think is really good. So he named the two laws, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. Matthew adds, on these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. All right, so there's our setup. This is, I don't know, I think this is a really cool story. Let's talk about what we've got in here and why this is so good. It's a scribe. One of the scribes came up, and I think it's even possible to think that, well, it's probably an actual Pharisee scribe. He's a scribe, but he associates or considers himself a part of the Pharisees, right? But anyway, he's the guy that asked question number 3. It's difficult to say, like if you were just reading the Matthew version, you might think that, oh no, the scribe actually, he's liking everything that Jesus is saying. He's kind of compelling, and he wants to test him like in the good sense, okay? But you'd be guessing more there. Mark, thank goodness, from my perspective, he makes it way, way more clear. This scribe was testing him, but in the positive way. He had already seen that he had answered them well. And so when you test a thing, sometimes you're testing it because you want to disprove, and other times you test a thing because you want to prove, which leads to approving of that thing or whatever. So he's doing it in a positive way. And now, one more little side note. In this podcast, we've talked on a number of occasions how commandments must be prioritized. And it's not a they may be, it's a they must be, because life is going to bring situations where there are contradictions between commandments. And we talked about one of the simplest and earliest and easiest rules. Well, what if you had 2 commandments that really, really seem to apply in any given situation? One of them was a positive commandment, like thou shalt, and another one was more like a negative commandment. We think of the words thou shalt not, or whatever. Well, the positive commandment supersedes the negative one. That's just a thing. And there's all kinds of stuff like that. And we talked about Jesus, prioritizing human suffering, alleviating suffering, etc., over things like Sabbath or whatever. So this is the thing. It's a constant within Judaism. But now what this guy's doing, he's asking Jesus to rank or prioritize what's the number one? What's the tippity top? What's the one that, all others are beneath this? And it's not at their expense. He's not saying, give me one that I can follow so that I can ignore the rest. He's simply saying, what's the most important one? And all the others, in the questioner's mind, in Jesus' mind, everything else remains. It's all good. So Jesus, he goes straight for the direct answer. He actually quotes Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 5, and it's those verses, they're very, very popular. Samuel, what are they known as?
The Shema.
That's right. So he quotes from there, and he also quotes for a second one. I know the guy only asked for one. The second one comes from Leviticus 19:18. We've talked about these things before. You can go look them up if you want. Now, we could simplify these 2 laws like this. I mean, even easier than what Jesus said. Love God, love man. I mean, that's simple, right, Samuel?
Yep.
Now, in Matthew, Jesus even adds that, and I read it, all of the scriptures depend on these 2. Love God is first because, well, just think about it just for a second. If you don't have that one, you have no reason for obeying any other command. You either love God, which is like, I guess, accepting that he exists and accepting everything about who he says he is, all that kind of stuff. If you don't have that, no other command matters. So obviously, that's at least one reason that one would be first. But then there's also, and Jesus wasn't the only one to do this, but these two verses are actually connected by the text itself. If you looked at Leviticus 19:18, you looked at Deuteronomy 6:4 and 5, they're connected by the phrase, and you shall love. In Hebrew, forgive my pronunciation if it isn't right, but it's something like ve'ahavta. And I mean, we look at that and it's like, well, what's the big deal? They both started with, and you shall love. Well, it's not that common in your Old Testament and in the Torah, the first 5 books. And so they noticed, you know what, there's a connection here. Now, again, this isn't saying, nothing about this is saying that all the other commands can be ignored and that you can just focus on these two. That's just silly. If you go, you could look at Romans chapter 13, verses 9 and 10, Galatians chapter 5, verse 14, James chapter 2, verse 8. All of these have that little thing about loving your neighbor as yourself, as if, you know what, man, if you could keep that one, it's like you're keeping it all, right? But they're not saying that as if just keep this one and ignore all the rest. What they're saying is that one is a good representative of all the others. So all these commands together support these two, or they point to these two. Or you might just say they provide the detail for these two. They're a quick and easy summary. But a summary is only a condensed or abridged version of a whole. And it's supposed to effectively point back to the whole. And so I was writing all this out, Samuel, and I'm bringing up something. I know this is from a day and an age. You probably can't even relate to it because you're younger, but maybe you can. I don't know. When I was growing up, we all had to fix our own cars because, one, we were poor, and number two, we were poor. So if you had somebody who could really teach you how to do all these things, that was great. But for some of us, we were stuck buying something called a Chilton guide. And this thing was so classic because it had pictures and it had step-by-step instructions. You could do anything to fix your car using a Chilton guide if you had, just a little bit of skill, a little bit of brain, whatever. It was fantastic. But now, okay, I've painted that picture of a Chilton manual, okay? Now I want you to imagine, well, what if you got a Chilton guide and it was just a summary? If all it said was, here's what you're going to do. You're going to tear down your engine, and then you're going to replace this part, and then you're going to put it all back together. I mean, is there anything untrue about that?
I mean, not necessarily.
No. It's completely accurate, completely true. And is it actually describing what is going to happen?
Most likely, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's totally it. But if that was what the Chilton manual said, you'd feel like you wasted your 1999. Because it's not telling you anything about how exactly it is that you love God, how exactly it is that you love your neighbor. You can't just make it up yourself. You're going to end up with an engine that never works again, unless, you're extremely talented, get whatever. So anyway, that's the thing. These two laws, they're not replacing everything else. They're just a summary. So when he says the word depend, I think maybe to help us get a vision of what that looks like, maybe we could think of the word hang. All of the other commands hang off of these two. And maybe you might even in your head get this image of, as opposed to them just sort of floating off in the air. They do depend on it. They do hang on those two. They're all related. But anyway, there's that. So anyway, I just wanted to get that image out there because so many people look at the law and the Torah and all this like it's not valuable. And I mean, it's a complicated thing in some ways, but to just toss them aside is the mistake. We need to understand there's real value there. It's like a pot of gold. So anyway, Jesus is quoting Deuteronomy, and he adds an extra word. I don't know if you noticed that, Samuel. We could probably spend a lot of time trying to figure out, okay, why did he do the extra word or whatever? But what we're going to do is try to focus on, okay, what exactly was it that he added? And how did his questioner take that? Because I think that's something really important, something good we can take from this. So Jesus includes the original. If you went back and you read it in Deuteronomy, you got heart, soul, and strength. That's all good. But Jesus adds mind. Now, we've mentioned before how scriptures use the word heart the way that we today would use the word mind. Okay? So today, when we say heart, Samuel, what are we talking about?
I mean, a lot of people take it literally, but it's, I guess you could say it's like all of your being, all of your essence.
Well, like today, people usually think of it as like their emotions.
Oh, okay.
The things that we feel. And maybe even to some extent, maybe, our drive and our desires, that kind of stuff.
Gotcha.
Right? And when we think of the mind, we think of intellect, thinking, and maybe even our conception of our own self, our own being, right? Our consciousness or something like that. But when you're in the scriptures and you see heart, it's a lot more like what we today would call the mind. And you might even go further and say it's actually sort of both. So when they say heart, that's including all of that. And so that actually makes this hard because Jesus added the new word, mind. So here we are talking about, hey, when you see the word heart, think more like mind, but then Jesus added the word mind. So it's going to make it hard for us to kind of really pick at what's going on. So what's being communicated by this word when you see it in your translation as mind is something more like deep thought and understanding. So it isn't just thinking and intellect. It goes beyond that into understanding. Now, those words make sense to me. I don't know if they're going to make sense to you, but I'm hoping that you can see there's something a little bit different between conscious thought or intellect and this idea of understanding. So I don't know. Samuel, you got anything before I continue? There's a whole bunch more. I'm going to stick with the same text, but those seem like important concepts, and I've said a lot of stuff already. Anything in there?
Well, I guess the only thing I'm struggling with, I know within Judaism, they're Pharisaic at least, there's this sense of not adding words to Torah or removing words to Torah. So how would have the audience taken Jesus adding this in whenever they would have been familiar with the Shema very well, and they would have recognized, like, wait, he just added something, like, that's not right.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple of things about that. Number one, you are already familiar with things like the Targums, where they seem to be a bit of an amplification of the scriptures, where they try to write the scriptures but include some of the common understanding and interpretation in them. So we already see them doing things like that. We already know the Talmud, etc. Now, that didn't exist in Jesus' day. It's coming after. But all of the thinking, all of the oral stuff existed. It just wasn't written down yet. And so you know that they do go a little beyond. So I think we need to be careful, on one hand, not to be too literal about adding something. What they would be meaning is something more like, are you actually changing the definition? Are you putting something in there that God never intended in the first place? Okay, so there's that. But the second thing is you did a great job of setting up what's coming up, because we need to look at, well, how did his audience take it? That audience was this scribe that was asking the question. So let's see what he says. This is good. The scribe tells Jesus that he is right. Now, You may hear that and you might think, wow, that's kind of arrogant. Here you are telling the Messiah that he's right. But I don't think that's fair. I mean, I think this guy was being very honest and very sincere. This was good conversation. And, if it makes it feel better, you might just think of it more as I agree as opposed to you're right, that kind of thing. But then the scribe does something super cool. He states what Jesus just said right back to him, paraphrased. And this is such an important part of conversation and learning. I'm going to say we've lost to a great degree today, but it's so important. We need to do this a lot more with one another. Just say it back. This is what I hear you saying. What he does is he elaborates on the God is one part. Okay, Jesus said it. He basically just quoted. Okay, but what he does is he goes to this thing with there is no other besides him, which is kind of cool because that's also back in Deuteronomy. It's just in chapter 4, verse 35. So, all right, scribe, well done. Is really good. So he's repeating it back, showing he understood, and actually enhancing it to a degree. So it's good. And then he demonstrates that he totally understands what Jesus did when he added the word mind. He replaces what Jesus said with your soul and mind. He replaced it with just the word understanding. And this is so good. Our very soul, and this isn't, we're not talking about our eternal spirit, okay? We're talking about the soul. It's the nephesh in Hebrew. It's the thing that we share with the animals. So our soul, our life, our being, and our deepest thoughts, the things that actually drive us to be who we really are, together they make up our understanding. And so we must actively love God. Now, and I guess part of this is, like if you think about your brain alone, we can think about a lot of things. But when it gets down to it, we actually act on our understanding. And so this guy gets it. It's really cool. This dude, he's a scribe, and we would say of the Pharisees, as far as we can tell, he gets it. This is really good. And then the scribe adds even one more little awesome bit of understanding. He says something about living out these two commands. And that is, again, it's referring back to all of the detail that they summarize. But it's this idea that living out these two commands outweighs all of the offerings and sacrifices that you could bring. And in case you need to prove that this guy is right or something like that, Samuel, how about you read from 1 Samuel 15:22.
And Samuel said, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams."
Yeah. So, if you were like Jesus, hint, you're not, without sin, you've never broken any commands or whatever, okay, you would never need to participate in the sacrificial system, at least from the standpoint of atonement and forgiveness. The sacrificial system actually covered more than that. It's much more rich than that. But that is a part of it. But if you were without sin, you'd never need to participate in that part. You could, or I guess you would, Jesus would, still participate in like the offerings, the burnt offerings, the thankfulness, the fellowship part, all of that. Many of the verses about sacrifice and sacrifices have been misunderstood. God required it. He's the one that said, this is what I want. And he even loved it. Words directly out of his mouth. God loved it. It was a token of obedience. There was obedience in it, but it was a token of obedience. So God only hated sacrifice, which, that shows up at a couple places in Scripture, and this is what gets misunderstood. He only hated it when it was done improperly, when it became just an act, when it was, this is just kind of what we do. I break all of these commandments. I'm nowhere near being the image of God in my everyday life, but hey, it's time to go and offer a sacrifice. No real obedience behind it. Well, God hated that. The sacrifices were supposed to be the culmination of obedience. So anyway, additionally, whether we call it love or obedience, it was a priority over the sacrificial system. And we see that even like when Jesus is doing some of his stuff, like alleviating human suffering over the Sabbath. So it's in this question and answer and the interaction between this scribe and Jesus, this is really, really good stuff. And in the end of it, Jesus offers this guy a great compliment. You are not far from the kingdom. And for a man in his position, given everything that had been given to him, to be able to step out of that and see what Jesus was bringing to the table, this was awesome. And we know that many, many, many struggled with that and didn't overcome it. So this was good. He had a lot of culture, training, instruction, all that stuff to overcome, but he had surpassed the other scribes and Pharisees in the Matthew 5:20 sense. That was, your righteousness must exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees kind of thing. Now, today, we call it deconstructing. That's the popular word. I got to say, by the way, that can be done well, and that can also be done not well. It could be a good thing or a bad thing. So, use caution. I'm just going to say, I had to go through a period of deconstructing, but I believe that it was for good. I didn't end up in some weird place. I ended up in a better place. Now, of course, some people are going to listen to things I say and think I'm weird, whatever. But if we talk long enough, I think I can, help them see, no, that there are reasons for all of this. You still may not agree, but you won't think I'm just a dork. Anyway, this dude, this scribe, he was well on his way. And this interaction, again, I think it's awesome. It's so awesome, in fact, that even those listening around them were awestruck. Now, probably the culmination of the three questions, if this really did all happen all in one setting, whatever. But they were awestruck. They weren't going to ask any more questions. And why should they? His teaching was unassailable. Now, you could willfully disagree, of course. Anyone can. But in the end, you're just going to be wrong. That's all there is to it. So, all right. Whew! A lot of stuff on that one, Samuel. What do you got?
I think that this is a convicting section, and it's making me wrestle and have to take a step back and think and rethink a lot of the things that you just mentioned. I did want to just add an illustration, how you were talking about how these two commandments, like loving God and loving man, are kind of the foundation of the entire Torah.
Yes.
What came to mind for me is like, and you were talking about the Chilton guide with cars, so
right.
Adding to the car analogy, like those two commandments that Jesus mentions from the Shema are kind of like the frame of the car, and the rest of the Torah is built on the frame.
Yeah.
So you can't have a complete car without the frame, and you can't have image bearing seen in the Torah without loving God and loving your fellow man. So
yeah.
I don't know if that image helps, but it seemed to help me in the moment.
Yeah, but if all you had was a frame, it's kind of rough. You still
Yeah.
need steering wheels and mirrors and seats and engines and lights, all the stuff, right? It'd make it a good car. Yeah, good one. What else you got?
I also wanted to go back to the mind part that Jesus adds, because I know that you mentioned that it could be confusing, and even I'm still struggling with it. So could I pose a exercise for you to do, Paul. Could you do the Paul March Targum version of Jesus' words in verse 30 with everything that we've learned and how you've introduced these concepts? Could we rephrase it like in a summary quickly so that the listener we can make sure that they're clear on it before we move on?
Yeah, I guess I could give it a shot. I can tell you this. I know I can think of one resource in particular where they really break these down in great detail, and I wish I had that in front of me because it would be the perfect answer to your question. But let's go on and give it a shot. It says, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Okay, so when we're talking about the heart, and as we've discussed before, this relates to what we think of as ourselves. It's the way that we think. It's the conscious idea of ourselves. It has to do with our will and our emotions and all of those things. But then you get to the next one, and it says soul. It's like, okay, now wait a minute. We know in the general sense in our scriptures, when we're talking about a soul, we're talking about the nephesh. And so when we talked about heart, we talked about things like our thoughts and our consciousness, intellect, will, emotions. But if we go beyond that, there's like this, and the beauty is you can see this both in animals and in humans, because again, we're going back to that nephesh. There is contained within your physical body. I guess there are people in the world who would disagree with this, but I think it's easy to look, whether we're talking about humans or animals, to look at them and recognize that there's something or someone in there. We see something beyond their physical body, and we're not thinking about their thoughts or their will or their emotion. We're thinking about, but there's a person in there, or there's a being in there. And I mean, all you got to do is have pets for a little while, and you're like, oh my gosh, this thing, it's like a real being, it's all of this stuff. So heart and soul, it might feel like they get a little bit confused, a little bit overlapping, whatever, but those are the way that I would talk about those. So there's your heart, as in like thoughts, will, emotions, and then your soul, your very being. And so now those two exist. And then when you go to mind, now it's like, but wait a second. Somewhere within the thoughts and the will and the emotions and your very self, there's still something more. There's some part of you that is able to look into the world around you, whether it's people or the creation, or what do we think of like language and thought and all of those things, and to take from all of that a comprehension, a seeing into things, an understanding, and know something more about the world around us. And so it is with that understanding that we are able to love God better. So if your thoughts and heart, will and emotions, you're loving God by submitting them to Him, your very being, that that person that you are somehow within you, that is dedicated to loving God. And then as you understand more and more of the world around you, that gives you more tools, if you will, to love God. Okay? And then your strength, this is an interesting one because it's the word might. It's actually more about your resources, everything that is within your power. Now, this we think in modern terms, we might think of things like money or possessions. Okay, that's a real thing. But it's also going to include, like, for example, my brothers, just they have this unbelievable ability to understand and fix anything. Now, I'm the guy that needs the Chilton guide, okay? And then I can do pretty okay. But they can just take stuff apart, put it back together. They just get it. That is a might. That is a strength that they have that can be applied to loving God. So I realize a Targum would have done this in like a slightly extended paragraph. I did it in like, a Sunday sermon, whatever. But I don't know. Sam, those are the things that I see. And I don't know if that's actually getting at what you want or if it helped at all. But there you go.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't think that I'm in the wrong to say that this teaching by Jesus, in terms of from an Eastern Jewish perspective, it's so much more complex than what our Western minds and Western evangelical teachings typically offer. And, the way that you describe the complexity, nuances of this teaching just showcases that. And it's almost, is it wrong to say that it's almost as if it's each tenet is building off of one another? And then what I mean by that, and it's going to tie into the strength part. So like you have love the Lord your God with all of your being, that eventually like that encompasses all of your personhood that makes you, and then from there, what makes you eventually results practically in how you understand the world and act on it. And then I got this teaching from Marty Solomon, the Hebraic thought with all of your strength. You could interpolate that, and with all of your very, like
right,
everything that you've got with heart, soul, mind, being, personhood, understanding, do that to infinity % that you're capable of. Like it.
Yeah.
Can you say that it's a building type of process with the commandment?
Oh, I think that's a great way to look at it. Yeah. I think people normally, and this is true, part of what our whole podcast is about. People read this stuff, and it's like, oh yeah, right. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Got it. Okay. There is a deep well here. Just this one statement. You could spend your life pursuing this, right? So yeah, I think it's really good to dig deep on these things sometime. And when you see something like what you're talking about, yeah, it's almost like they build on one another. Great. That's a good image, a good vision of how this works.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Final thing, I know I've got to let us continue on. This is just a cross reference to a quote from the Babylonian Talmud. And it's important because these two characters in this little snippet were present like in just slightly before Jesus' time, the two schools of thought, Shammai and Hillel. And it is directly referencing this question of what's the greatest commandment. So here's the quote, and we'll post a link in the notes too. On another occasion it happened that a certain non-Jew came before Shammai and said to him, Paul already knows what it is. We may have talked about it before. This non-Jew says, I will convert to Judaism on one condition, that you teach me the whole Torah while I stand on one foot. Kind of weird, but Shammai chased him away with the builder's tool that was in his hand. So that didn't turn out great.
Beating him with a stick.
The same non-Jew came before Hillel later and said to him, convert me. Hillel said to him, what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and learn it. So,
yeah.
Doesn't that sound very similar to Jesus' words? So I just wanted to pose that.
Yeah, and it's important to note that Hillel and Shammai preceded Jesus. These thoughts, these arguments were very common in Jesus' day, and Jesus was, in fact, I guess in one sense, endorsing the argument and one side of it, enhancing it a little bit in his own way. That's really, really good. It's really good. And I love the very end of it, because it supports the very thing that we had said about, hey, it's not getting rid of the rest and you only have to do these two. It's that these two are a summary and you need all of the detail. What did he say?
Go and learn it.
Yeah, this is the Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and learn it. Well, why would you do that if you didn't need it? Well, you do. That's what helps you understand the big thing. So yeah, it's good. All right. Anything else?
I'm done.
All right. Well, let's go on. At least we're going to make it to question 4. We can put a wrap on this thing. But this is good because, there are some parts where we can move a little quicker and some parts where, we just can't because there's so much here. And that's where we're at. So here we go. What are we looking at? This is Matthew chapter 22, verses 41 to 46, Mark chapter 12, verses 35 to 37, and Luke chapter 20, verses 41 to 44. We're going to read from Matthew. So here we go. Now, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question, saying, "What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?" They said to him, "The son of David." He said to them, "How is it then that David, in the Spirit, calls him Lord, saying, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet'? If then David calls him Lord, how is he his son?" And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. Okay, now I have to say, it's not true. More people will ask him questions. But I think we get the idea that Matthew's trying to convey. So let's not get too wrapped up in that. But here we go. It's kind of the big uh-oh moment. The tables are turning. Jesus is the one who's now asking the questions. But given all that we've seen so far, I think it's easy for us nowadays to kind of hear this one and go, I don't know. That didn't feel like a big gotcha, like the one that settled everything. But it is interesting, and we'll work through it. I just think that it probably had a much greater emphasis and impact back in his day. But anyway, let's go ahead. You got the Pharisees. They're still hanging around. They're listening, whatever. And Jesus takes advantage of the moment, and he asks this question. Okay, and again, we're talking about the Christ, the Messiah. We think that it is Jesus, the one who's actually standing there asking this question. But even in just the most general, abstract sense, the question is, you got this Christ, you've got this Messiah, whose son is he? And we just need to notice, this is in no way a gotcha kind of question. I mean, this goes up there. This is on par with things like today when we joke around, we'd say things like, well, is the Pope Catholic? Yeah. Or does a bear poop in the woods? Uh-huh. I mean, the answers are super, super obvious, right? And they knew the answer. They didn't hesitate. They said, the son of David. And they were absolutely right. There's nothing weird or goofy about that. But then Jesus gets them with the gotcha, if you will, right? He says, well, then why does David call him Lord? Now, that may not sound like a big deal to you, but look what's going on. First of all, he's quoting Psalm 110, verse 1. Psalm 110, just as a general rule, this is possibly the most often quoted in our New Testament writings, and it's used to support Jesus's messiahship. Okay, so Psalm 110, really popular, and it was also in the first century. There was the idea, the tradition, I guess you will, the understanding that, hey, this isn't just about David or whatever. This is about Messiah. Okay, so if we looked at the Greek underneath the phrase that we see here as the Lord said to my Lord, well, I don't know. There's not a lot of help there. It's just kind of the same word, whatever. But if we go back to the Hebrew, remember this comes from Psalm 110, go back to the Hebrew, it says something more like, Yahweh said to my Adonai. Both words get translated Lord, but it's Yahweh and Adonai. Now, Yahweh, that one's easy. We are totally talking about, like the God, the one who, there's none besides him. There's only one. He's the Father, right? That kind of thing. But Adonai, I mean, it's a much more utilitarian word. It could be used for when you're just calling someone Lord, and they don't have to be like God. They're just Lord. You could be calling them Master, or it can actually be used when we're talking about God, like the big guy, Father, right? The same one as Yahweh. So it's the word is it's a lot harder to nail down. So again, we're understanding that this is referring to Messiah, and it was common understanding then. But why was this a difficulty for them? Well, because the Pharisees' expectation, and I don't know that we've talked about this a lot here in the podcast, but their expectation that this Messiah, the one that they were expecting, hoping for, whatever, they only ever expected him to be human. And let me emphasize, human only. And so in that sense, now we're going to get back into culture and those kind of things. Think about first century Jewish culture. How could a father ever say to his son or call his son, my Lord? That's just not a thing. That defies everything in their culture. A father would never do that. But this verse, I mean, it definitely leaves open the possibility for something more because it uses the word Adonai. What is he talking about, right? What is actually being said? Now, Jesus credits David with understanding from the Holy Spirit when he's actually writing this, which I think is super cool. David is the one that wrote, the Lord said to my Lord. And so first we need to understand, who is this David? Well, David was the king. And as such, this is a very interesting thing, and it relates to something we said in an earlier podcast. He was understood to be a son of God because he was a king. Well, now, how does that work? I mean, that's kind of weird. And understand that it's kind of like, what's a good word to use? Maybe a title or a status. So in the strictest sense, this phrase, a son of God, it's referring to a heavenly being. It's one that ruled with God in the heavenlies. And yet, somehow, it gets used with humans. Like in the case of a king in Israel, they were considered to be a son of God. Now, it isn't used just for that. We know that Israel has been referred to as a son of God, or maybe individually you think of as the sons of God, that kind of thing. So it happens. And where does this come from? It's emphasizing an elevated status. Okay, that part's easy to get. And in some measure, it's also speaking of a future potential reality. And this actually gets back to like the garden story. That the idea was that humanity was supposed to rule with God in creation. But because creation and the heavenlies sort of overlapped, if you will, God was dwelling with man, there was a sense in which man had at least some measure of ruling in the heavenlies as well. And so the original man, we could think of them as both son of man and son of God, except that sin came and creation and the heavenlies are no longer touching or overlapping or whatever. So it's a very interesting thing, that future potential reality. So for David, and let's just go back in the natural sense, the cultural sense, for David to call any other human Lord, especially a son, and David being a king, he's considered a son of God, it didn't make any natural sense. He had to be something more than merely human. This son had to be something more than merely human, something more than just his son. And we know, of course, it's because he is also a son of God. David was a son of God because he was a king. Jesus is son of God. He also is a king, but it goes much deeper than that. And so what we see is, well, what do you got when you got two sons of God? Well, one of them has a greater status than the other. And we know this all through God's dealings with man and creation, and we even get some indication of it when we're talking about creations in the heavenlies, there is such a thing as status or hierarchy. And so Jesus' status as a son of God is higher than David's status, even as a son of God, as a king. And so that is how, even though he's his son, even though David was a king, all of these things, David can call him Lord because his status is greater. Now, boy, this is a lot. I just feel like these last couple episodes, we're throwing so much at you guys. Jesus is also, we've talked about this. What's the favorite thing that Jesus wanted to call himself in the scripture, Samuel?
The Son of Man.
Yeah. He rarely, and it's all debatable. Some people would say never, but let's at least go with like super rarely ever referred to himself in any messianic sense. He wanted to be known as the Son of Man. Well, this points back to Daniel 7. Yeah, it's elsewhere, but Daniel 7's like the big linchpin, or, the focal point. In the strictest sense, a true Son of Man, okay, he was supposed to rule with God in creation. That's what we see in the very beginning of our Bible, the very beginning of the story. And we know that humanity, well, they blew it, right? But here was Jesus, and he was without sin. So in a sense, he was a true human, like the ones that were created right at the very beginning, before sin happened. And so in that sense, Jesus, being a true human, he truly qualified to rule here in creation. So if we kind of put all this together, we got Messiah. He's a sinless Son of Man, so he is indeed human, and he's fully qualified to rule with God in creation. But Messiah is also a Son of God, and in that sense, he is fully qualified to rule with God in the heavenlies. So therefore, though he for sure, he is a son of David, but that's not all that he was. And this was really messing with their heads. That was the part that they were, when Jesus said, well, how can he call him Lord? It's like something in their heads was going, well, then he couldn't have just been a son in the human sense, like ancestry. He had to be something more. Now, in hindsight, we look back and we've got this idea already in our heads of his divine nature and his human nature combined in one and all of this. It doesn't feel like as big of a brain twist for us, but for them, it was a really big deal. And they're seeing this thing of, oh my gosh, the Messiah isn't just human. He had to be something more because even David called him Lord. So anyway, I hope that somehow in that you're seeing how this question for them was actually a really big deal, even though it may not hit us quite as hard as it did them. So the beginning of the story, before the fall, you've got heaven and earth overlapping. Mankind is set up to rule. The rule is primarily for creation, but in some weird way, it also affects or touches or reaches into the heavenlies. The end of the story, and this is, I guess, an important part, like the end of your Bibles after we're all resurrected, there's a new heaven, new earth, all that stuff. It also has the heaven and earth overlapping, and mankind will again fulfill that original role. And it's going to be in some way touching both creation and the heavenlies. So Messiah is the firstborn of this new humanity, the one that David can actually call Lord. So, I don't know, there's a lot of stuff in there. Some people liked what they were hearing. Some people didn't. But they all agreed, apparently, according to Matthew, they all agreed on one thing. They didn't even want to bother asking him any more questions because, it appeared that he was just on a different plane, a different level of understanding, something. And they felt, you know what, we can't touch this guy. We may not like some of the things he said. We may not understand all the things he says, but in the end, as hard as we try, it just is unassailable. And so they were kind of giving up. Anyway, there you go. Those are the 4 questions. Samuel, what do you got now?
Man, you were right about saying that the past 2 weeks have been heavy because I've just been wrestling this whole hour about all the stuff that Jesus has been saying. First off, I want to premise by saying I really like how you went about treating this passage with Jesus's referencing of the psalm, and the overlapping of the earthly realm and the heavenly realm, and how that connects to the Son of Man, Son of God aspect of reality, Messiah himself, the age to come. It's great. I love it. And I don't think that is what the Western Church has attempted to do whenever they try to interpret what Jesus is saying here in the Psalms. And unfortunately, like for like modern day traditional Orthodox Jews who do not recognize that Jesus is the Messiah, they treat the common interpretation here in the New Testament for the church as the church is trying to like Christianize the Old Testament scriptures, or or that we're trying to insert Jesus into a passage in the Old Testament where he didn't belong. And I mean, you could do a very quick Google search. You could just type in "the Lord said to my Lord" Judaism interpretation or meaning, and there's a slew of articles where they bring their competing interpretations. And it's like I mean, I was just reading one earlier today where they say that at the beginning of Psalm 110, like where it says like a psalm of David, they said that the Hebrew like doesn't exclusively have to mean composed by David. It could also mean like a psalm to David, and they're
right.
They get into things like David didn't get to reap the fruits of building the first temple, like it went to his son Solomon, and yet David was composing psalms that would later be used in the temple that he wouldn't get to experience. And like some Jewish thoughts, like, well, this is like a psalm spoken in the third person that Levites will sing, saying that like the Lord God said to our master King David, like sit here at my right hand until I make your enemies at your footstool. And so I guess it's kind of a question is like how, not that a ton of us are going to have conversations with Orthodox Jews where we're living now, but I would struggle with how to have a conversation with someone who they're asking legitimate questions, and for good reason, based on how it's been misinterpreted. So do you know the question I'm getting at is like how we would wade those waters with those that are opposing that Messiah-ness within this passage?
Well, okay, quick answer is nope. But let me expound just a little bit, and here's the difficulty. If, like, just say, for example, you wanted to have a conversation with an Orthodox Jew who had these questions or an existing interpretation or whatever, he is starting with a set of ideas. I call them sometimes lenses or filters, or the way that we view the text. And I or you would be starting with our own set of filters or lenses or whatever. And there's an immediate difficulty that we have to overcome. And that is, okay, I'm looking at these words, and this is what I see, and it seems obvious. And if you don't see that, I'm not even getting what you're talking about. I can't relate to what you're saying, so to speak. And they're doing the same thing. And I'm not saying that that's bad. I'm saying this is just normal human stuff. And you also must understand that there's been 2,000 years, okay, probably a little less than that, but you get the idea. 2,000 years of the Jews being treated poorly by Christianity in many, many different ways. There's probably as much or more support for Jews and Israel, etc., today than there ever has been in all of that history of the past 2,000 years. it's like gone up and down, whatever. But there's still plenty of anti-Semitism left today, even within the church. So what they're seeing in their response, it's also got a lot of that history baked into it. And so there's going to be an immediate difficulty in being able to have the conversation at all. Like, at all. But even if you could somehow overcome that and say, no, really, let's sit down and have this conversation. I just offered a whole bunch of stuff about how we might view that Psalm 110. What is it that we think maybe Jesus was seeing in that? Because Jesus, he credits David with writing it. He says that David wrote it in the Spirit. So that goes against what they think. Well, why would they accept that? They don't accept our New Testament scriptures as valid. So there's a difficulty. But if they did accept that, and go, okay, well, whatever, we'll give you that. Let's say that David wrote it and that David wrote it in the Spirit. Well, then you still have this difficulty of trying to get them to see all of those things that I just laid out there. And the added difficulty of who in the world says that I'm right? These are things that convince me. These are things that make sense to me. And when I'm telling the whole story contained within our Gospels, I think it's compelling. That's why I repeat it. But that doesn't make me right. Nothing on this podcast is right because we say it. Now, people who say things other than what we say, well, there's nothing that makes them right either. Right? So it's a hard thing. So when you say, how would I talk about this to someone? How would I approach someone about this? Dude, I don't even know. All I can say is you need to develop some relationship with that person so that there is some sort of trust between you as people, so that when you say, look, can we just talk about this? Why do you say this? Or when I say this, why do you think that's so wrong? Or whatever. There's actually some water under that bridge, and you might actually be able to have a real conversation. But that isn't just with an Orthodox Jew. This is with every other denomination of Christianity in America and every other thing. These are so difficult things in our lives, Samuel. It's troublesome. And the people who are going to listen are the people who are already fill in the blank, questioning, searching, I don't know, willing to hear, whatever that is. And they're few and far between.
Yeah.
Especially nowadays. Did that get at what you were asking?
For sure. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, you brought up details that I wasn't thinking about in the moment, and even I'm not going to link this article just because I don't think that it would provide much good for the overall benefit of this teaching. But later in the article, they're saying that, it's suggesting that Messiah is replacing the Levitical priesthood and, getting rid of sacrificial system and stuff. And it's, right there that shows that, they're influenced by misinterpretations that the church has offered, and they're using that as like fuel for their opposition, whereas we're coming about it saying, like, we've never suggested that those things are going to go away, and we're
right.
What you said is so good. It's like we're simply trying to get into the mind of Jesus to figure out, like, what was he saying, not like what we think what it's saying, but back to the original context.
Yeah. It's a very difficult task. And, hopefully we're doing some good. But, it's a hard thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. Anything else?
No, I think we should give people a break and let their brains recover and start wrestling and weighing all this stuff out.
Yeah, hopefully not too long from now we'll hit some things that are a little easier to digest. But, it's a big week in Jesus' life. We left for almost a quarter of the Gospels approach it. So, there's got to be some big stuff in here. So
yeah, a real reality is that okie dokie most between now and the end of the Gospels could be this heavy week after week. So I guess
could.
just eat your Wheaties and have some strong coffee to help you push through it.
Yep. And just like that guy in Jurassic Park, hang on to your butts. I don't know why. I just love that line from that movie. All right. Well, Samuel, let's call it done.
Okie dokie. Thanks for listening to the Okie Dokie Most podcast. Don't forget to subscribe so that you never miss an episode. And be sure to leave us a rating and a review to let us know how this content is impacting your life. You can find out more information about the podcast at www.okiedokimos.com. And if you'd like to get a hold of us, please send us an email at okidokimos@gmail.com. Until next time, we pray that you will do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. We'll talk to you again soon.